Hey guys, I'm going to go over my case number one presentation, and I'm going to talk about my most recent observation, number two, which was my choice setting, which was my church. And I chose this setting to use as my case presentation because of all the recent COVID restrictions and regulations, just added an extra challenge and layer of challenges that I saw in the observation, and I wanted to incorporate that in this presentation since it's a part of our world today. So I've been a part of this church for many years since 2011, and I've been interpreting for the last 3 years. I haven't interpreted recently due to just being in school full time, and the setup is a little bit different, and I just don't have the time to devote right now to it. And so some of the other volunteer interpreters were feeling a little overworked. So we actually hired 2 interpreters for our church right now, which was really, really cool. So I actually reached out to some of my friends that I interpret with at the school district, and that's how one of them was hired. And that was the sermon interpreter for this observation. And then the music interpreter, so it was a team interpretation. The music interpreter, I had not known before. And so it's a little background on her. She has been an interpreter for 15 years in all various different settings. She's been a church interpreter for just about that same amount of time for different churches. And it was, I think, her second or third time interpreting at this church. So pretty new, and with all the extra COVID restrictions, it was a new experience for her, somewhat new experience for her as well. The other interpreter, the sermon interpreter, she graduated from a 2-year program here in Colorado, and I have worked with her for several years, and that's kind of why I chose, also why I really wanted to observe her in more detail, because I just believe that she's a great mentor for me, and I want to have her interpreter skills eventually, and so it was really great to meet with her and discuss her decision making. So a little background on her is she attended the 2-year program, and she also attended a lot of different, the Denver School of Arts. And so she studied opera and music and acting, drama, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and how that was a beneficial pre-assignment control that she brought into the sermon. And so she is also a CODA, and she has been working for the school district for 5 years. And this was her second time interpreting for the church. So the whole church sermon was about an hour and 30 minutes. And just a little background on what it used to be like. So we have a very large church, and the main room where the pastor is and the worship team and the rest of the congregation is in the main room. And right now it's completely spread out, 6 feet apart for chairs, and everybody wears masks except for the worship team when they're singing and the pastor. And typically the interpreter would sit at the front left of the stage, right below the pastor, and he's on the stage. And the first 2 rows, usually, right in front of the interpreter, would be the deaf consumers. And we would also have a lamp right there too to make it a little bit brighter, especially during the songs, because they had the lights dim during that time. So now, due to COVID, we are using a hybrid model, and they provided a very large room right next to the main room. And that room has the seats spread out 6 feet apart. The room is actually very dark. It had dark black walls painted, and they had a TV right behind the interpreter, but it was high on the wall, the black wall, and the interpreter sat on a tall stool. So she had the screen right behind her, because that is where the screen is where the service was streamed. So it was alive, but it was on the TV from the live stream of right next door in the main room. And so the interpreter sat on the stool. She had a tall table next to her, which also had a computer monitor right there, which was kind of tilted sideways. And I talked about this in discussion. It wasn't right in front of her because I kind of gave just a 2D view of everybody that was logged into the Zoom hybrid. And so it was off to the side at an angle to kind of give that 3D view. And the TV was behind her, so she was interpreting that way. And they also had a lamp because the room was dark. The lights were not on in the room, and the room was really dark. And so the light, kind of just used her as the focus of the room. So it worked really well. Another another demand that came up that I did talk to, well, actually, she brought it up because she said I was like, that stool didn't look very comfortable. And what was your control choice of why you used the stool? Was it because the TV was high? And so we kind of talked about that a little bit. And she said they played around with it the first couple times to see what would work best. And she said the stool worked best with the tall table and the monitor and the screen, just because of all the electronic extra layer challenges. That's what they found worked best. She said one of the biggest demands that room presented was the very dark wall, because she likes to wear black, being an interpreter, but she had to wear a solid color shirt, but that would give a little bit of contrast from the black wall. So she ended up wearing a dark purple shirt or a dark blue shirt the next time, she said. So that was one of the demands that she actually brought up from the setting environment. So the main church has about 1,000 people, many people logging on. They have several different services. They have another campus that's also streamed, and they have one Saturday night service and 3 Sunday morning services. And the interpretation is that morning. And some preparations that the interpreters get to do is that the music is sent out in about a week advance of what the order is of the service and the music and the song. So the church interpreter would interpret the first 3 songs, and that's what the sermons or the service starts with, and then also the announcements, and then one more song at the very end of the service. So she in all interprets about 30 minutes. The sermon interpreter interprets right after the 3 songs and announcements, and she interprets the message, the sermon of the service from the pastor, and it is about 45-minute long. And I know that is a long time, and that's something that I remember from when I was first mentioning interpreting for my church, and Pauline was my instructor at that time, and she said that's way too long. And so I talked to my fellow interpreters about splitting that up into 15-20 minutes, but we just decided that this would be the best for us just because of preparation. And so it is a lot of preparation, especially for me. And I know the volunteers and now the hired interpreters are very motivated and take preparations very as a priority and very seriously. So some of the preparations that they get to do is they can attend the Saturday night service. They can virtually go log in and watch it. They can physically go into the church and watch it. And the music interpreter can kind of get more feel of the songs. The song interpreter also can look up all the songs, of course, their lyrics, their meaning, other examples on YouTube. Sometimes you find something that's completely not, what they're looking for, but they can use some of that, come up with their own. And then the church interpreter, the music interpreter can also hear the message if they prep that way, and they could be familiar with the meaning of the message and use that to feed signs and to support the other interpreter. The sermon interpreter receives the notes of the sermon, and all of our interpreters receive this information. So everyone's aware of the music and the notes. The main pastor doesn't give a lot of notes, and he also changes things from Saturday night to Sunday. And so that's just something that we're aware of and that we know as a pre-assignment control. So those are some of the preparations that they do. So for the actual observation, because we have our own room, we have a lot of older consumers that are in our deaf ministry, and it's nice that they have their own space. Everyone is required to wear a mask, even in our small or our separate room, except for the interpreter while she's interpreting. And there were about 6 deaf consumers, 1 hard of hearing consumer, and 2 hearing consumers in the audience, usually some family members of the interpreters or the deaf consumers. The ages range from 27 to 60s, and they were all female except for, wait a second, they're all male except for the 2 interpreters and 2 deaf and hard of hearing consumers. Everybody wore a mask. I talked about that. Just checking my notes here so I don't forget something. There were a few consumers logged onto Zoom. I couldn't see it exactly. I know one couple, older couple, are more high risk. They have some health problems, and so they log on to Zoom each week. And they are a regular part of our deaf ministry. Our deaf ministry is anyone who wants to join. It's hard of hearing, deaf, anyone in the audience. They don't have to come to church. They can come, and just hear about the message. We discuss the message, meaning, a lot of feedback, intense feedback. Our team interpreter always takes notes on feedback, and good and bad, positive and ineffective. And then our main deaf consumer, who's the lead of our deaf ministry, he takes very intense feedback notes too, usually words that can be said in a different way. And so after directly following the sermon, we all meet as a deaf ministry, which is great just to socialize and gain that relationship and positive rapport with each other, because that's just going to have everybody be more comfortable in saying what they need. And that brings me to my next point of the sermon interpreter. From my view, I noticed that she, just in meetings that we have for the school district, when she's interpreting for our deaf and hard of hearing teacher who's deaf, she voices all the time. She's very willing to, our supervisor's like, who wants to interpret today for our, our deaf teacher? And she's always willing, and she's very outgoing. She jumps into things. She is prepared when she jumps into things, but she's very outgoing and wants to help in any way possible. She also started a initiative to get pay increase for interpreters, for the educational interpreter in my area, and actually a lot of in Colorado. We met as a group of interpreters, and we had the support of our supervisors too, but she led the group, and we actually reached out to HR and ACE, which is a program that supports classified staff. And she led that initiative, and we did lots of research on pay from different school districts and compared to community interpreters, which can sometimes be $20 more, and how we have to hire community interpreters to come in if any of the interpreters are sick or have an appointment, have to take off. And so just saying, we need to find quality interpreters by paying them more and having a floater interpreter, so we don't have to hire a community interpreter. So anyway, that's just a little background of showing how motivated and dedicated she is, which is another reason why I chose her to watch her interpretation from my observation. So the homily was included with the sermon. The scriptures are usually shown on the screen. There's 3 screens in the main room, and you can see the main screen from the virtual streaming. So the scriptures are shown on the screen. The pastor usually reads the scriptures word by word, but there are some words that are more emphasized that the whole congregation will say out loud. And so that's another way that the interpreter, emphasized those words, and to make sure that they understood that those are the words that we were saying along with the pastor. So she did a really good job doing that. Then he summarizes the scripture usually and connects it to a story, which was really great. That provides more meaning that we can show in ASL. The benediction was included at the end of the sermon. The pastor usually summarized the story or the message, and then he says a prayer. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, because that was a really great opportunity, a lesson that I learned from the sermon interpreter. Okay, so like I said, the sermon interpreter has a background at the Denver School of Arts. She's trained in theater and opera and jazz. And I was wondering, I didn't know that before until we met and I asked her about that because the sermon, is talking and, collaborating together and having a lot of participation from the audience. But then at the end, the pastor changes his tone, his feeling, his, everything. And it really emphasizes the goal and the meaning of the message. And the music actually starts playing just a little bit in the background just to kind of give it that emotional effect. And our pastor is amazing, but I know it's judgment. Our pastor is really great about, he gets a lot of emotion involved because he's very passionate and he uses a story from his life to connect. And so this just was shown so great by the interpreter. She, had a more posture, straight posture for the sermon, and she used a lot of rosha. But when that music started, and you could tell the tone of the voice of the pastor changed into the more sentimental shift, she used her pre-assignment controls and her experience from opera and jazz and theater to show that. And she has gotten many comments that she's able to show that, and that's a strength of hers. Just through her body movements, her facial expressions, her signing kind of slowed down, but then she was emphasized the point, and she had such a great effective vocal tone, affect. And so we actually talked about that for a long time during our interview. It was really awesome to see that. Like I said, she's very outgoing and extroverted. So the sermon interpreter, so she, I can tell, has a lot of control choices that are liberal. Of course, she has some conservative as well. She's pretty balanced through the spectrum, but she also, from my observations and from seeing her from previous, work experiences where she's ready to jump in and she, I'll talk about it a little bit and from one of the demands that I'm going to talk about, but she's very, very extroverted and wants, her goal is, to provide meeting for the deaf community, and she does what it takes to do that. I think maybe the church setting is a little bit conservative, requires more conservative um, control choices. The fact that it's in a separate room now does give some more opportunities for liberal control choices, but I think just in general. Um, but of course, both of them are control options and they both have effective and ineffective um, results. Because she was a new-ish interpreter, you could tell that she did use some more experimental control choices, and we got to talk about that after. Um, because I said that I've observed her in other areas, I have noticed that her preference is ASL. It's one of the reasons why I use her or get to access her abilities because it's something that I want to focus on. However, I know my experience with knowing the deaf consumers at my church, they do prefer more PSE, especially for the music because want to they want to sing along. They want the words and singing along. And of course, some expansion is needed to provide that meaning as well, but they really want to sing along and they want to read those scriptures together. And so I noticed that she did use more of a PSE language type and style, even though it doesn't match hers. She matched the consumer's preferences and she met with the consumers beforehand to see what works well with them and what they preferred. So it's just really great to see that even though her preference is different, that she conformed to them and used that as a priority. So that was a lesson that I learned that was very important. So the interpretation or the message of the sermon used a lot of comparisons and finger spelling names. So those are the two of the questions that I asked the interpreter about. And I noticed that, she obviously used comparisons by role shifting and just to ask Was that repetitive for her? And, some of those comparisons were more in depth than the others, but she said it was, a little redundant, but she just used her space well. And I noticed that as well. Finger spelling happened a lot, especially during the comparisons because they were talking about comparing different types of music and TV shows. And so finger spelling had to be included in there. And I asked her about, what makes her control choices of finger spelling or signing or pairing them together. And also specifically, I noticed so many names in the Bible that are being spelled, and I didn't know. I did know that there's a couple names that are often talked about. Paul in the Bible, and he wrote scriptures and verses and stories. And so Paul is a P and it's writing on your hand. And I know Peter's over here. So I do know those two, but there was a name from the Bible called Nicodemus. And I asked her because I did notice she spelt it a couple times. And she said for names like that, she spelt it once very clearly, but she does not make name signs up. And I actually didn't notice that she used Paul or Peter. I don't think they were mentioned, but she does not make name signs up for anything, which I thought was really great. She would spell it clearly and then make sure that using back channeling cues that they understood that. And then from then on, she would spell it, but not the whole thing perfectly. It would be more of a faster, NICDS or something like that. She would just spell it. It would be quicker and, that she kept up with keeping up the message meaning, because since that name was already set up. Or she would use roll shift and set that up as a reference in space. I didn't talk about the specific church interpreting experience from the sermon interpreter. She actually attended a Bible study, a Deaf Bible study, um, quite some time ago. But one of the things she did notice though is the main interpreter that we have there asked if she was a Christian, and she says she wasn't, but she is open to every kind of religion and beliefs, and she just believes that everybody has their own beliefs, and that's great. And she is actually really studying right now to learn more about every different type of religion and beliefs out there. And so it's really great that she could be honest and but still be very connected to that personally. One of the main demands that I wanted to talk about was how the face masks that were worn by the deaf consumers and team interpreter. Um, because they were wearing those, it inhibited the complete view of back channeling cues. And that's something that we really focused on and she talked a lot about because it was a very challenging thing. She said one of her main goals is providing meaning. If she doesn't see those back channeling cues, it's hard for her to make sure that she is providing meaning. The mask covers up most of the face. She can't read lips. She can see the eyes barely. So she just had to rely on other back channeling cues. So as a control, she trying to find the exact control that I said, but she observed other alternate back channeling cues. She used posture, body shifts, the facial expressions that she could see from the eyes, non-manual markers. If they turned and looked to another person and kind of looked confused. Some concurrent demands. The team interpreter was feeding signs, and since they had that preparation a little bit from the sermon, they were able to do that from the music interpreter. And she also was taking feedback notes, and so the sermon interpreter knew that. Face masks are required by the church and the state for safety. The state of Colorado mandates face masks anywhere when you leave the house. The interpreter had prior relationship with the team interpreter. So the music and sermon interpreter had a prior relationship. And so they talked about the back channeling cues that they could employ, the other types that they could use, the alternate back channeling cues that I discussed. And same with the deaf and hard of hearing consumers. They talked about, alternate cues that they would show by role shifting and pausing or posture. So I guess a week prior, one of the deaf and hard of hearing consumers quickly pulled down his mask to ask for clarification. So because of that, the interpreter knew that that could be a control option. It says, say pull on your mask if they look confused. It's not the ideal or most effective just because of the mandated of wearing masks and those requirements and guidelines. And the other concurrent demand is that the masks weren't clear. I've heard from many deaf consumers that they often fog up, and I know there's all different types. I know my school district provided shields. Those weren't, from my research, not as effective as and safe. And I know there's just more research out there to find more, little. I know they make little spacers now that hold the mass out farther. You can put Dawn dish soap, I heard, to make the fogging reduced. And so we talked about a lot of alternate controls as well. So clear mask could have been requested from the church. I know I'm part of a sewing group that's related to that same church that we make dresses for kids, in need and out of the country, and that's something we could have requested, but it's just something that they didn't think it was effective right now until there was more research done of how to make masks not fog up. I talked about the face shields. And I think just focusing on preparing and knowing the message and the meaning even more, because that's going to provide more meaning and understanding for the deaf consumers since they can't access all those back channeling cues. The other thing is the deaf and hard of hearing consumers were aware that they could use sign language to let the interpreter know if they weren't understanding things. The interpreter, could stop interpreting and ask if they understood if she noticed the back channeling cues weren't clear, and that they may be confused. And she also talked that she heavily relied on the team interpreter to offer support and feeding of the signs. One thing I didn't mention in the control choice that I did list is that and the sermon interpreter told me this, she specifically scanned the audience to watch for other back channeling cues that any of them would give. Obviously, if the masks weren't on, they could, look up and make eye contact to see. But because of this, she had to continually scan the audience, which actually took away from the message because, and this was the negative consequence that I put, is because she wouldn't be able to use eye gaze, and that's really important when talking about God. And that was reduced of role shifting and becoming the character because she constantly had to look at the audience. Another post-assignment control, she said that they would continue to talk about if that was working, if it wasn't working, what's needed to change for next time, and just to review the feedback notes in detail from the interpreter and the deaf consumer, just to make sure to clarify if they had more questions. The sermon interpreter was also very familiar with DCS, so that made it very accessible to talk about the terms, and she understood, and that was really a great part of the interview. Yeah, and I think that wraps up my case. I just think the lessons that I learned is to be, just because a church interpretation is a more liberal or conservative environment, taking advantage of having that separate room and using more liberal control choices, because I know for me that's hard anyway. And having the example of watching her as a mentor and using, what she knows and conforming that to the cultural and linguistic needs of that group. Um, some of just keeping in mind that some of the deaf consumers may not all be on the same page of their language preferences. So if there's time in the message, she could have, used more PSE, but then also paired it with some more expansions and meaning. And that's another lesson that I learned. And I learned that we just need to be flexible and communicate, because of all the changes due to COVID, it just adds that second layer of challenges, like I mentioned, and just everyone being on the same page and have that constant communication before and after the church sermon, I think is huge in this setting. I know that doesn't happen in other settings as much, but just to have this more like family relationship is really important. And so that's, something that the lead interpreter took in consideration when she interviewed different types of interpreters that we hired. So I think that sums up everything, and I really appreciate you guys listening to this and offer any other feedback that you guys might have.